So welcome to DevSecOps, the good, the bad, the ugly. I'm Zach Kennord, and I am your host. This videocast series is about all things related to DevOps, but we do place an emphasis on making sure security is a part of that practice. Today I have with me Sean Davis. Sean, can you introduce yourself and tell a little bit about your background?
Oh, absolutely. So I'm Sean Davis, currently the Chief Raconteur of Sean as a Service. My focus is really around helping businesses make the digital transformation, assisting them with implementations of DevOps, DevSecOps, and cultural changes within the organization to help them find the value and the success in their transformation journey.
That's great. So Sean, where have you done some of these transformations at and kind of the history of that?
Oh, so that started several years ago. I think the very first taste of transformation came at Mannheim. I was following a colleague of mine, Jason Riggins, and
Okay.
he had been, kind of talking about, hey, we need to do things differently instead of just virtualization. There's so much more, and developers need to have a seat at the table. And, we're already doing a lot of the automation and the scripting.
Right.
So we kind of got behind that, learned a little more about what it was. He started implementing one of the first teams, and we set up Puppet and a lot of these other tools that were needed to kind of kickstart things. And then we worked with remote work and Lean and Kanban, kind of visualizing our work, and it kind of grew from there.
Right.
I moved over to IHG, and we were working on a transformation for their reservation system platform. So multiple billions of transactions a month.
Wow. Yeah.
Through a hotel reservation system, and they wanted to move it to the cloud. So we had to rethink everything about how we did business and what we were doing with our technology, really bringing the developers to the forefront. From there, I went to Agile Thought. So they're a predominantly consulting practice. So I got to do a little deeper level of Agile and DevOps.
Okay.
Also picked up a lot of product management at that time and some coaching that we did for the business to kind of help them with their organizational transformations all the way down to the individual teams, and then what frameworks fit best for them and kind of that continuous improvement mentality.
Right.
And then was brought over to Equifax as a chief transformation evangelist to focus on how to help drive innovation programs and continuous improvement programs within the organization and connect our internal customers in that development first environment to our external customers and our market, to start creating feedback loops so that we could learn from everyone that we partnered with, from the
Right.
customers that we do business with every day to the consumers that are out there using these products and these platforms, and help really drive that developer first mentality. So there's a little bit of DevRel, a little bit of transformation, a little bit of DevOps, DevSecOps. It's fun.
No, that's great. And Sean and I actually connected on a LinkedIn post where I proposed a question of, what's your thoughts between DevOps or DevSecOps, mostly because my videocast series is called DevSecOps. And, I've heard feedback over the past 3 years on the differences between the names. I'm curious, Sean, your thoughts between DevSecOps or DevOps, or how do you go about naming a transformation or your initiatives in order to communicate to the business and the stakeholders?
I think it really boils down to the audience that you're appealing to.
Right.
It's less about the name, right? We could have debates all day long on
Right.
DevOps
Yep.
versus
Yep.
DevSecOps and
Yep.
when those practices emerged, but it's really about the audience, right? So if you think about at the executive level of the business, they're thinking business transformation, they're thinking digital transformation, some type of transformation that is inclusive of every part of the business or the focal points of the transformation, whether that be technology and security, et cetera. Different businesses operate at different maturity levels of their transformation in different phases. When you start getting down more to the practitioner level, right? The people that are in the roles that are doing the work, the program managers, project managers, developers, technical writers, security engineers, SREs, those types of things. It really depends on what side of the business this is coming from. Often there's a catalyst within a transformation, right? There's something happened or something is about to happen and we need to change.
Right.
And then they brand that as a transformation, and then there are certain set criteria that help support that change being realized by the organization. So usually this comes from either technology, security, or a combination of both. And talking with leadership, getting a good understanding of what their understanding of DevOps and DevSecOps is, because there is a very clear delineation. A lot of people will say, well, DevOps, you should always use DevOps because security should just be built in. Well, I'm like, that's cool, but it wasn't, right? Or else DevSecOps wouldn't have come. I think you've got practitioners from technology. When you talk about engineers versus security engineers. From an engineering perspective, when you talk about security, they're thinking of, hey, how do I make my code more secure? They're thinking of the tactical,
Right.
specs that need to be covered. When you talk to actual security organizations about security, they're thinking about the processes, the governance, the compliance of that code and the products that they offer.
Right.
And they're supporting the platforms that are consumed by technology. So two very different sides of the same security coin.
Right.
And the goal is to kind of put them together. But in the same way that we both have very different jobs and we're coming together to solve the same problem because we want to release a secure product that provides value to our customers, the security practitioners generally see it as DevSecOps, whereas the technology practitioners see it as DevOps.
Mm.
So I found a lot of success in whatever leader is driving that transformation. They're the ones kind of holding the flag for the transformation. I let them choose which one of those terminologies best match and fit their culture and their maturity. Because earlier maturities generally use DevOps, later maturities or very security centric ones will use DevSecOps.
Sean, you brought up a good point in regards to the fact that security was often an afterthought within DevOps, even though, as many people talk about that, it should be baked in. And that's where the name DevSecOps comes from. I think it's interesting because when I would go to conferences 3 years ago and talk with DevOps engineers, and I would, talk to them about what Sonatype does, which is helping to automate open source governance. And they would say, that's really great, but security is not part of my job. So that was definitely something
Yes.
that I saw. So curious to just get your feedback on, where do you think the name kind of derived from what you saw in the industry?
So, it's very interesting that you say that because, if we think about security just as a practical discipline in anything that we do, I'll take you way back to NASA when the coin software engineer was actually created. It was termed by a woman in NASA. They were building some software for, I believe it was the rovers. Don't quote me. I'm not a
Right.
historian. But so they wanted to have a framework or a name around what they're doing with this very specific technique within, NASA, right? It's not
Right.
just, oh, well, we're building something, right? Because engineering is very common in NASA, right? You've got electrical engineers, you got mechanical engineers, right? So someone was saying, well, when we write code for things, what should we call that? So this woman came up with software engineering. Well, the thing about it was back then, security was very well tied into it. Testing of their code was very well tied in. It was kind of all one solid practice. But as it gained popularity as a term, we're talking about everyone across the industry. So think about, COBOL, think about, even the mainframe stuff. I was just having a conversation yesterday with someone. Did you know in the 70s, the mainframe actually had a software, I can't think of the name of it just right off the bat, but it was the first DevOps software that was technically ever created, and it was being used on mainframes way back in the 70s, right? So this
Yeah.
is nothing new that we're doing now.
Right.
But then as you look at how the world has progressed, you think about architectural engineering, right? So Rajan Gupta, a good friend of mine, had brought this point up around why security is so important and why it has segmented itself and DevSecOps has started to emerge. Is with architectural engineering, you have to consider like the weight of what's going to be in the building. You have to consider how much it's going to settle over so many years. Like security itself is built into that practice, right? You want to make sure the building doesn't collapse on the people. Think about electrical engineering, right? Don't go sticking your screwdriver in something without turning the power off first, right? Safety is built into that as well.
Right.
Civil engineering, right? You can't have two opposite directions are usually green at the same time. You can't have four directions green at the same time. So there's timing of stoplights. And if something happens, they all start flashing yellow so that we know how to take our turns and obey stop signs. And that's built into learning how to drive. But that safety and that security is built in. Within the software industry, that's not something that's often taught when people are coming up and learning. And if you look back at older software like COBOL, Fujitsu COBOL, time clocks are being created. A lot of security suites, a lot of software wasn't as prolific. Software was predominantly things that were applications that were ran locally for the organization. So they didn't have a lot of exposure to the outside world. Web apps weren't as proliferate.
Right.
So there wasn't as much of a calling for security. But as software began to change, schools started teaching this more and more prevalently. you had a larger need for security. And then people started coming out of the woodworks like, hey, we need to start focusing on this, just like anything emerges in the market. So as time has gone on, I think the same thing happened with DevOps, right? There's that age old people constantly butting heads of technology engineers and security engineers constantly fighting and having inroads being built.
Right.
I think it's kind of the same thing with DevOps and DevSecOps is, those engineering practitioners, if you talk about Patrick Dubois, right, says we need to figure out how to apply some of these same principles of Agile to like the infrastructure, right? Like how do we make things delivered faster through software and through the physical assets that we have?
Right.
So security wasn't a conversation they were having at that time. They were just like, how do we automate this? How do we apply some of the same techniques here, right? And then it grew into this huge, amazing thing that it is now. And at some point, the security practitioners came over and was like, hey, we know that you kind of just lumped us in with this because, if you think about the 3 ways that Gene Kim talks about, none of those are specific to software. None of those are specific to security. And I think that's done for a reason, is to show you this is a practice or an approach that anyone can use, right?
Yeah.
So over time, more practitioners are going to come in and find their way. And it just so happens that marketing in the world that we live in today loves to be able to make a buck off of new initiatives and new ideas, right? So then that drove those lines a little bit deeper. But at the end of the day, both the initiatives, I believe, are trying to terminate at the same thing, but have very different approaches and goals at what they're trying to accomplish in the doing part. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that made a lot of sense to me. Really enjoyed the history lesson that you provided around NASA. If you're watching, be sure to give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. If you had any additional thoughts or feedbacks from some of the history that Sean was providing, be sure to let us know what you thought there. This is part 1 of a part 2 series that I'm doing with Sean, so I'll ask him some additional questions, and we will post that next week. So thanks so much, Sean. Look forward to talking to you again.